There's a quote in my book, and I think it probably formed the entire basis of writing my book about the death, which is a quote from a 3,000-year-old Indian epic, the Mahabharata. And it's an interesting story where a nobleman is struggling and a spirit is trying to help the nobleman. And the spirit says, in order for me to help you, you must answer a series of questions. And one of the questions is, what is the most surprising thing in the world? And the nobleman answered, day after day, man sees countless people die, yet he behaves and acts as if he will live forever. And I see this so many times in my own practice and in general in society. I mean, I'm not ascribing blame to anyone, but I think we have become such a transactional society in terms of, people come into hospital and they want an antibiotic or they want an opioid and they get something. And then they come to a place like having advanced cancer and they're told that unfortunately, while there may be some treatments, there is no cure for the cancer. And it is quite likely that their life will end with this cancer. And so many times people say, well, what do you mean? How can there not be something? Because I think we often go through our lives without contemplating that we are mortal.
Hi, I'm David Aben, founder of The Bucket, and your host for this podcast with Australian oncologist Dr. Ranjana Srivastava. Ranjana is a Fulbright scholar and award-winning author and radio personality. In addition, she is a regular columnist for the Guardian newspaper, where she writes about the intersection between medicine and humanity, and a frequent essayist for the New England Journal of Medicine. She is also, and I think this is pretty cool, a recipient of the Order of Australia Medal, the OAM, for her role in oncology and improving doctor-patient communication. Today, I look forward to talking with Dr. Srivastava about one of the biggest challenges she faces in her day-to-day role as a doctor who sees death and dying up close, the acceptance of mortality, and the benefits that can come of it. I'm pleased to welcome to the podcast Dr. Ranjana Srivastava. Hello, doctor. Thanks for talking with me.
Thank you for having me on.
And you're half a world away in Melbourne, is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. Melbourne, Australia, not Melbourne, Florida.
Yeah, it's your morning, it's our evening the day before, so it's pretty cold here now, and it's your summer, right? Still summer?
It's a beautiful summer's morning. I must say that Australia has been lashed by wildfires and bushfires, as you will have heard, but it's a beautiful morning today, and the sky is clear.
Well, that's great. Well, I really appreciate you giving us this time. And I know you've written a lot of books and magazine articles, but the one I want to start asking you about is your recent book called A Better Death, Conversations about the Art of Living and Dying Well. And the thing that struck me most about this title was your use of the word art, the art of living and dying well. What an interesting word to use there.
Yeah, well, the book has been on my mind for a number of years, or rather the subject has. And I've now been an oncologist for many years. And what strikes me is that I see so many people who are terminally ill, who are dying. And really, it does seem to me that it's an art when people die well and they are able to take stock of their life and prepare to die. And many of us don't do that well, but the people who do are quite inspiring. And I thought that, we could all learn a lesson or two in our own lives from how these people have managed to do what they do.
I'm sure there are some very rewarding parts of being an oncologist, but the downside, of course, is that you're not just witnessing people die, but you're entwined in it. How has that changed your outlook on life?
Well, yeah, I mean, whenever people hear that someone is an oncologist, often the first question people ask is whether it's depressing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually not. I think it's an incredibly inspiring place to be in medicine. It can be very rewarding, and as you said, to accompany people not just through the period of diagnosis and prognosticating, etc., but to hold their hand through life and then through the journey of dying. Is quite profound, and I don't know of anybody who works in oncology who is not somehow changed by that. For me, I think that the way it has changed me is to really live more deliberately. I see a lot of people, young and old, whose lives are upturned by a sudden diagnosis of cancer. And yet, the good news about cancer is that not everybody dies. Increasingly, survival rates are improving, which is wonderful. We have better and better treatments. But I think the mere brush with a diagnosis of cancer changes people. And certainly looking after these people, whether they survive and go on to be discharged from our clinic, never to see us again, or people who unfortunately end up being palliated, everybody teaches you something.
Are there any things you talk about living more deliberately, but are there any specific things that you found that you've changed the way you've lived, or can you give an example of what it means to live deliberately?
Yeah, look, it may sound cliched, but so many of my patients have taught me this, and I see this so much about getting your priorities straight. So, on a day to day basis, even what's important? What am I going to worry about? What am I going to fret about? And which things am I going to let go? And I know that we all strive to do this in some way or the other, but I think that there is something about working in oncology that brings this very much face to face for me. And and really trying to keep that in my mind is important. The other thing I have learned, and again, this is common knowledge, common book knowledge, I suppose, that relationships matter, and we hear about this everywhere. And I see this on a daily basis about how the relationships you nurture and the ones that you make time for, how they give back to you. And so that's something that I am very deliberate about planning how, to see my friends, to see my family, and to make time.
Now, do you see with obviously some of your patients who are going through cancer and some that have died, there is this they have to face their mortality. But what is it like to watch the family or best friends of these people? Do you see a change in them as well?
Absolutely. One thing I often say is that cancer affects not just the patient, but also the family, people who are close to the patient. And I think um, in the healthcare, in the medical profession, there is so much to do and say to the patient that unfortunately we can forget relatives and loved ones, but they are very important, and I see how much they stress and how much they care. And of course, we all know about the unpaid labor of friends, relatives, and loved ones when somebody is affected by cancer. So absolutely, I see this all the time, and I have deep respect for people who choose to stay the journey.
You mean the caregivers that stay
That's
with
correct.
somebody, right?
Yeah, because it's hard work. It's physically hard work many times. It's emotionally breaking. And yet, time and time again, people make a choice to take care of some of the most seriously ill, needy, and vulnerable patients in our society. And that's something that's really admirable.
Yeah. One of the things you talk about a lot in your book is your surprise that how few people have come to terms with their own mortality. It's an issue with people who have been told that they may be dying, and they just can't seem to face it. That seems like a lot of your day can be spent dealing with that inability for people to accept it.
Yeah, there's a quote in my book, and I think it probably formed the entire basis of writing my book, A Better Death, which is a quote from a 3,000-year-old Indian epic, the Mahabharata. And it's an interesting story where a nobleman is struggling, and a spirit is trying to help the nobleman. And the spirit says, in order for me to help you, you must answer a series of questions. And one of the questions is, what is the most surprising thing in the world? And the nobleman answered, day after day, man sees countless people die, yet he behaves and acts as if he will live forever. And I see this so many times in my own practice and in general in society. I mean, I'm not ascribing blame to anyone, but I think we have become such a transactional society in terms of, people come into hospital and they want an antibiotic or they want an opioid and they get something. And then they come to a place like having advanced cancer and they're told that unfortunately, while there may be some treatments, there is no cure for the cancer. And it is quite likely that their life will end with this cancer. And so many times people say, well, what do you mean? How can there not be something? Because I think we often go through our lives without contemplating that we are mortal.
Right. That's the theme of the bucket, this idea of acknowledging and embracing your own mortality. And in order to say, I am going to die. How much time do I have left and what do I want to do with that time? But we also find it's obviously not people with terminal illnesses necessarily, but there's this inability to accept this and therefore plan. Another book that you wrote, After Cancer, A Guide to Living Well, is advice for people who have survived cancer. Do you think that people who survive cancer have a deeper appreciation of life, or is it the kind of thing that gets forgotten, almost like a survival instinct to forget it and not have to deal with it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And, I often say to people that as an oncologist, you would never say to somebody, well, now that you have cancer, it'll really change your outlook in life. But so many people come back and say exactly that. They say that the fact that someone thought, for example, that they had cancer and it was actually proven not to be the case, transformed them. And then many, many more people, of course, who I see who have cancer, who survive it, who say it absolutely entirely changed their thinking about what matters, what they're going to worry about, how they're going to look after themselves. I mean, obviously, there isn't 100% strike rate for everything. And just this week, I've been talking to several of my patients who continue to smoke quite heavily. Despite having survived their cancer. And we have had a conversation about this obvious risk factor that they know about and they've been educated about, but they find it difficult um, to tie it all together. But for many people, at least emotionally and psychologically, cancer does transform them. And obviously, I'm very sympathetic to the fact that for many people, it's very traumatic.
Oh, yeah.
They lose their jobs, they don't go back to the same positions, their body shape may be altered, their relationships are fundamentally altered. Many, many of my patients talk about losing friends during a cancer treatment where people just don't know what to say, how to behave. And one of the hardest things for many of my patients is not just having an illness, but also losing relationships during that illness. So yeah, I think cancer changes lives in so many ways.
Which side do they come from? Those lost friendships, lost relationships, the patient or the friend?
I also interestingly receive a lot of calls from friends and acquaintances who say, oh my God, someone's been diagnosed with cancer in my workplace, and I just don't know what to say. I don't know how to behave around them. And I think that leads in a lot of instances to detachment.
Mm-hmm.
My patients, on the other hand, say that now that they have been diagnosed with an illness and many of them are going through treatment, they feel acutely that they don't want to be a burden to someone. So sometimes they stop reaching out to people because they just feel bad about it. They feel as if they have nothing positive to offer, but only something to ask for, whether that's company or someone to walk the dog or someone to take them to an appointment. And so I think that's how the break occurs when the well person doesn't know how to respond. And we don't really talk about this kind of stuff when we are well.
Right.
Um, so that's what happens.
Yeah, that we're trying to get people to talk about that. That's one of the reasons for the bucket is to get people to talk about it. And so, we can't obviously prevent a diagnosis like cancer, but we can get people in the frame of mind that they're making the most of their lives. One of the things that you talk about in the book that really connected me was the idea of equanimity. Um, to be calm in the face of a tragic diagnosis. Do you see that as a path towards peace when facing your own mortality?
The first thing I'd also like to say is that you don't just die from cancer, obviously. Mortality happens to all of us for whatever reason. So to cultivate attributes that help us die well, no matter what we die of, is really important. Um, Equanimity is something I really admire. It's probably my favorite characteristic to watch, to reflect on when I'm in clinic, because I'm constantly sort of astonished by how some people manage to keep steady and calm and not be complacent, by the way, but just have their wits about them as they go through a very, very difficult time in their life. And I'm very curious about what makes people that way and how, were they always like this? Did they become like this? Did they choose to do this when they got sick, etc.? But really, it's a wonderful attribute to cultivate, because I think it really helps you navigate an illness well.
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering about what you thought about the causal nature of that. Like, are people who are like that better able to handle a diagnosis, or can someone who isn't like that uh, act that way in order to deal better with a diagnosis? Is that something you can control, or is it people just born that way?
I don't know. I think about it often, and I doubt that you either have it or you don't. I don't think so. And that's because I see, and in my book, I talk about particular patients who are quite young. And in particular, a young mother whose only dream really was to have children, to look after them, to grow old with them, and so on. And she was diagnosed with advanced cancer. And it was quite interesting. I don't think, this woman had thought much at the age of 40 about her own mortality yet, or even contemplated that her children might still be very young and she would die. But the sort of calm she brought to the clinic every single time was very impressive. And once I said to her, I'm really sorry that you're going through this. I mean, you can't help but feel helpless in these situations. And she sort of shrugged her shoulders and she said, well, we all have to die. My time just came earlier, and no one is to blame for it. And I think that way of thinking helped her so much in coping with all the trials and tribulations of her illness. It settled her family too. Everybody accepted that she was going to die, and it was all about maximizing time, maximizing quality of life, um, taking holidays together, and planning ahead. And I write in the book about attending her funeral. Several times a year, I will go to a funeral, as much for my own closure as the family's. And what struck me about this funeral is I went there sort of very apprehensive, thinking about what the funeral of a young parent might look like and how much sort of grief and bewilderment there might be. And it was one of the most serene things I have ever witnessed.
Wow.
If it was quite incredible, and everyone was calm and quiet, and it was as if they were marking something that they had been preparing for, and they knew it was coming, and the day had arrived, and they had a plan to go forward. And I found that amazing.
That is amazing. So how can we help people have this perspective, have this calm, have this calm without having to go through this terrible thing? Like it just seems like it's something that can help you everywhere in life, but it seems like in most cases it's only brought on by a sickness or something like that. Like I'm on a mission to try to figure out how we can get everybody to feel this appreciation and preciousness of life, not just people who are sick.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that part of it comes from not shielding ourselves from stories that may seem sad or that make us uncomfortable, and actually to again to go back to the fact that we are all mortal, and how do we help ourselves and how do we help each other live better and die better. And that really comes from um, sometimes it comes from quiet reflection and allowing ourselves to think about some of the deeper aspects of our lives than the day-to-day busyness which catches us all.
Yeah, and this idea of acceptance is definitely something we're trying to do with the bucket, and trying to get people to accept it, like I said, long before they have to. Have you had a chance to look at our website at all?
I did have a look at it when you first got in touch with me, yes, and I
Okay.
really commend you on this mission. It's an important subject to talk about. Uh, it's obviously um, it can have less attraction than some of the other things that we talk about in our lives, but it's so very important to engage with this.
Yeah, so if you are on the site, we have something called a bucket age. Did you happen to check to see what your bucket age was?
I can't think that I did, but I'll have
We
to
can
look
do
at
it.
that.
We can do it right now. So the bucket age is simply your statistical life expectancy minus your current age. And so
Right.
mine is about 85. I'm 61. So my bucket age is 24. And that's how many years statistically I have left on this planet. And
I like that.
so we
Brings
use
it home to you as to how many years you have to try to make a difference or
e-
do something.
exactly, and it's kind of like
Get your act together.
right, and kind of like when reading in your book, all these people, all these examples you gave of people who just weren't accepting and that they were going to die. It's the same with the bucket age. No matter how many people I talk to, when they figure out, when I watch them calculate it, they look at it and they go, "Wow," like they've never thought of this before. And we think it's a great way to put things into perspective and say, okay, for me, I have 24 years left. What do I want to do in those years so that when I do die, I don't have regrets, that I don't sit there and say, I wish I had done this. I wish I had started the bucket for me. So I guess my question to you is, what is your bucket age?
So I can tell you my age and you can calculate my bucket age.
Okay, I can try, but I don't have the number in front of me. But the purpose isn't
Oh,
to be exact. The purpose is to just get the perspective.
oh, so I would hope that my bucket age is about 40 or 45 years.
That's great. So now that you know your bucket age, you have to start planning and thinking about what you're going to do, and to what you were talking about before, what are your priorities? We have this thing we call the zoo metaphor, where you take the whole family to the zoo. Everybody's excited. You want to see the reptile house. You want to see the apes. You want to see the lions. You want to go to the gift shop. And but you never check to see what time the zoo closed. And at 1 o'clock, they say the zoo's closing, and you say, "Well, wait. I had all these other things I wanted to do." And I think that most people live their lives this way, that they're not checking to see when the zoo closes, and they they say, wait a second, if I had known the zoo was closing at 1 o'clock, I would have spent more time with the reptile house or something like that. And so we're hoping that people use their bucket age as that, to think about how much time they have left and how they want to use it.
That analogy is very close to my heart. I've never heard it, but even as I've grown older and I'm the mother of three children, I have a zoo membership because
Oh.
I love going to the zoo.
Has it ever
So,
closed early on you?
well, usually I get in there quite early and I leave late, so it hasn't closed early, but I love the analogy because at the larger zoos, I'm always, torn between catching this and catching that, and it really is about prioritizing and saying, well, how many things can we get to and also not be so tired and cranky that we don't enjoy them.
Right.
So it's not just about getting to the things we want to see, but also, or do in life, but also about having quality of life, isn't it?
Absolutely. So another question I ask all our guests is, and in your case, I think it's hits close to home because I'm going to flip roles with you for a moment, and I'm going to pretend I'm the doctor, and I'm giving you a prognosis, and I'm telling you that it looks bad, and you only have a week to live. And if you got that prognosis, what would you think? What would you have regrets? Would there be things that you wish you had done? And I'm not talking about regrets like you wished you could have lived longer, but just are there things that you say, I wish I had gotten to this? And in answering that, would that change how you think about things?
Yeah, and sitting across the table from patients and having these very difficult conversations about, and no oncologist can predict, no doctor can say that somebody has just 1 week or 2 weeks. But broadly speaking, many of my conversations are about people having weeks to months, months to years, few years, several years prognosis. And so it's something quite close to my heart. I think that those regrets very much for me would depend on what age I was being told that. So as a parent to young children, the first thing that would come to my mind at present would be the regret of not seeing my children grow up and seeing them realize their potential. And that's a very visceral response that you hear from many, many parents who say, I accept this for myself. This is my greatest regret. Um, I think other than that, I have really tried to limit my regrets, and I've learned from my patients. So I have close relationships, and I would say that I'm satisfied with a number of the relationships that I've cultivated. I have a very close family, and I think partly it is driven by what we spoke about before. You cannot be an oncologist and not think about this stuff and not change your own ways and your own thinking. Otherwise, I think it would be a wasted profession in a way. Um, so I think that would be a great regret that I would share with many parents of young children.
Do you see many senseless regrets?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I mean, nobody has ever said, "I wish I'd finished that PhD,"
Right.
or I wish I had built a bigger house. But time and time again, the regrets come back to relationships. It's actually quite profound. It's quite profound to listen to it and very moving. Um, when people reckon with their regrets, I would say almost universally, it's about the closest relationships that somehow failed, that either they did not honor or were not honored by the other person. And I see this both with patients and with relatives, loved ones who come in and say, um, my dad now is dying, and I'm so sorry that for the past 10, 20 years, we have not had a meaningful relationship. And then there can be this rush to reconcile. But also, I would say that for many people, it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming to think that all this time they have not been able to repair a relationship, or actually not thought about it, or said, well, I'll just wait till, I don't know, we all get older, or something happens, or I retire, or I find more time. But then suddenly you have no time. And I think that a lot of my time goes into observing this, listening to this, and trying to help people come to terms with what it is.
Yeah, there's that reminds me of a great quote from your book, from one of your patients. He said, "But I'm not done with life. My head is always churning with ideas that I always assume I will have time for later." And that must be crushing when you hear someone who thought that they would always have time later and they've run out.
Yeah, I mean, you feel disappointed on behalf of the patient. It's difficult to not put yourself in that situation and think about all the plans and projects, from tidying up the cupboard and drawers to writing another book to whatever it is. We all have plans to travel somewhere, to catch up or connect with someone. And it must be very harsh to suddenly put a limit on that. And the limit is not necessarily by saying you have 2 months to do this or 3 months to do this. Often it's not just the prognosis, but how ill people are feeling. So all of a sudden, the trip that you had always meant to take, it's not safe to take anymore. So you wanted to go trekking somewhere and there are no healthcare facilities. So although you are well enough to remain in the city of Melbourne and you will be fine, all of a sudden that trek you wanted to do with your son is not going to be possible. So that brings me back to this issue of seizing the day and of doing things as much as we can now, rather than storing them up for another day.
Yeah, I love that. I know you've done a lot of interviews over the years, and for this book, I'm sure. But I want to ask, besides obviously all the questions I've asked you today, what has been your favorite question?
Oh gosh, that's a good one. Well, I've never been asked my bucket age before, so now you've given me something else to think about.
Well, what
And
question haven't you been asked that you wish you had been asked?
oh, I've been asked all sorts of questions. I mean, people ask all kinds of questions. I think many people are genuinely curious about how one immerses oneself into oncology and sees cancer patients all day on many days of the week. I think many people assume that is depressing or why you wouldn't pick another career, etc., etc. So I've been asked all those questions about that. I'm a fairly open person. I feel that I share a lot of my personal experiences as much as is appropriate and useful. Um, I I think that the questions that we need to keep, the things that we need to keep talking about, and I can answer them, and many others can answer them articulately too, is just this whole idea about cherishing life and about leading a meaningful life. And I think in the modern era, and me included, there is such a rush to do things, and being busy is like a status symbol, and I think it's to our detriment.
Well, that is my last question was actually going to be, what does a meaningful life look like for you? But you just answered it. So
I'm sorry. Then you can ask me another
no,
one if you
that's
like.
perfect. That's perfect. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time. This has been great, and I really appreciate it. And I think our listeners will get a lot out of it.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. My husband was listening in the background for part of the way, and he thought it was a fantastic interview.
Oh,
You
good.
asked great questions.
I'm glad to hear it.
So,
Thank
thank
you
you, and
so
please
much.
let me know when it comes out, and I'll try to put it on my website too.
Okay, I really appreciate that. All right, good. I was going to say good
Bye-bye.
night, but good morning.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye. What a great perspective and approach to living a more meaningful life. I hope none of you out there have to be forced into dealing with something like a cancer diagnosis, but I do hope that you can let the concept of mortality be a catalyst that can help you make choices that can help you lead a more fulfilling life and eventually die without regrets about the things you wish you had done. To learn more about how to get the most out of your life by embracing your own mortality, go to thebucket.com. That's the bucket, all one word, .com. And if you know someone you think should be in a future Bucket podcast, let us know at bucketfeedback@thebucket.com.